We're doing it differently this time. I don't think we've ever done this before, which is that our speaker is in Peterborough, Ontario, instead of here. And there are some people out there listening online, watching online, including Gillian Holden, who's our speaker, whom I'm really happy to welcome. She's a new member, well, new, 2.5 years ago or so, I suppose, when she broke her wrist and her arm and was spending a lot of time trying to find out about her family. Her family comes from here. She's descended from, let me think, Jewetts, Tripps, Pickards, Clark. So all of those people are in Gillian's background, and she's been trying to find out about them. And out on the web, looking for things, she came across our website and ended up having a phone call with Elaine. And Elaine sold her a couple of books, and she joined the organization, which she could not have done before 2021 because we only met here. And it's a long commute from Peterborough. So, but since she's joined, she's been one of the most active and useful members, and one of the ones it's been most fun to have aboard. And a few months ago, she started working on some letters that she had acquired. She's going to say a little bit about that. And when we were talking about setting up our this year, Gillian said, well, I wonder if I could do one of those. And we said, well, come aboard. Yeah. And so it's time. If this all works the way it's supposed to, you're going to hear some of the things that Gillian has found out from those letters, and here's some of the letters, I suspect. So Gillian, take it away.
Thank you, Russ. Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this presentation about the Mitchell family of Scotch Settlement, New Brunswick, and the letters they wrote to their relatives who had moved to Canada West and settled near Ingersoll in Oxford County, Ontario. Michael Mitchell, the main letter writer, was the husband of Huldah Tripp, whose parents, brothers, and sisters had all moved west. Huldah's sister was married to David Clark, who had moved with the Tripps, leaving his Clark relatives behind in New Brunswick. Michael addresses his letters to brother and sister. Specifically, he's writing to his wife's sister and her husband. This could have been an interesting genealogical problem until a researcher sussed out the true identities and relationships of the people involved. Please hold on to your questions until the end of the talk, or enter them into the chat and I will answer them at the end. The slides are numbered, so it might be helpful if you're able to note the slide number as part of your question. Okay, so issue number 1. Oh, there we go. Okay, no more issue. Good. As a child, I always wanted to live in an old house that had an attic full of old papers, preferably in old trunks. That never happened, but unbeknownst to me at the time, there was just such an attic in my great aunt's house in Ingersoll, Ontario. In 1975, during a grade 9 history course, our teacher assigned us a family tree project. I excitedly began to interview relatives. During a conversation with my father's mother, I learned that in the attic of the house in which she'd grown up, there were still old letters and other family papers, including farming diaries and photographs. Reading through this treasure trove was an incredible experience that became the first step in my interest in genealogical research. 15 or so years later, during a visit with my great aunt, I got another look at the letters and made copies of them. Around that time, a friend and I traveled to the Mactaquac area of New Brunswick, where I met these descendants, Donna Clark and her father Willard Clark, of some of the letter writers. They told me, we always wondered what happened to the ones who moved to Ontario. In 2019, I once again came into contact with the family papers and photos, this time being asked to take them and do something with them. The following presentation is only a small part of the research I've completed. I did not find a previous genealogy of the Mitchell family, but I have been able to construct one. If any viewers are descendants or have further information, I welcome the chance to talk to you at a later time. Letter writer Michael Shaw Stuart Mitchell was born in Scotland on April 17, 1813, to Alexander Mitchell and Mary Macpherson. He and his siblings were born in Inverkip, Renfrewshire, very close to the port city of Greenock. Alexander Mitchell was born in 1771 and Mary Macpherson in 1782. Alexander was a native of Berwickshire, as is stated on his headstone in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. I have not found a record of Mary's birthplace. She and Alexander likely married around 1800 to 1802, since their first child, Janet, was born in 1803. Alexander Mitchell worked as a wright, according to a document he signed when apprenticing his son, William, to a Greenock baker in 1823. In English, Scottish, and Northern Irish usage, a wright is defined as a worker skilled in the manufacture, especially of wooden objects. It was the occupational name for a maker of a wide range of machines, mostly wooden. The term is found in various combinations, such as millwright, wheelwright, playwright, but when used in isolation, it generally referred to a builder of windmills or water mills. Donald White, in A Dictionary of Scottish Emigrants to Canada Before Confederation, Volume 2, lists some members of the Mitchell family who immigrated to New Brunswick in May 1827. Alexander and Mary had 11 children who left Scotland with them, but not all arrived in New Brunswick. It is alleged that two siblings, Lilius, aged 18, and John, aged 12, died during the voyage and were buried at sea. In a letter dated April 16, 1865, Michael makes a specific reference to the emigration, stating that the family departed Scotland on April 10, 1827. It appears the voyage lasted about 6 weeks, with the ship putting in at Halifax and then St. John. According to Lucille Campy's book, With Axe and Bible, the ship on which the Mitchells sailed may have been the Neptune of Ayr, which left Irvine, Scotland in April 1827 under the command of Master Miller. There are 3 other possibilities which warrant further research. The Caledonia from Greenock, commanded by Master Miller with 79 passengers. The Percival of Leith, which sailed from Leith under Master Johnson with 47 passengers. Or the Rebecca, which left Greenock with 20 passengers. White's book refers to the Mitchells as having come from Berwickshire, but this may be simply because Alexander originally hailed from there. The book also gives brief genealogical information about those family members listed once they arrived in New Brunswick, such as spouses' names, birth and death dates, and children's names. Michael married Huldah Coburn Tripp, sister of my 4th great-grandmother, Mary Ann Tripp, on March 18, 1846. They had 6 children who survived to adulthood: Sarah Jane, who married James Gray; Mary Macpherson, Mamie, who married Asa Van Wart; William, who married Fanny Hagerman; Isabella, who married James B. Campbell; Janet Clark, who married Alexander Lemuel Haining; and Amos, who married Sarah Martha Coburn. Their middle child, Jacob B., died at the age of 2.5 years and is buried in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. Michael wrote 7 of the letters in this collection, and his daughter Mamie wrote 2. Michael is a great name dropper, and his letters invariably give news of a great many family members and neighbors, current events, and agricultural prices in his region. His firsthand accounts of community events, the progress of the railroad, and his sharing of opinions about Confederation and the Fenian raids are unique. He provides primary source evidence of some of his family's vital statistics that are incorrectly reported elsewhere. Perhaps most interestingly, he makes references to likenesses or photographs of family members in Upper Canada and York County, New Brunswick, being mailed back and forth. How I would love to find these and see if any of them show the Ontario family members. This is the Alexander Mitchell headstone in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. This is the Mary McPherson Mitchell headstone in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. And this is a map of part of Bright Parish, York County, New Brunswick, from the Halfpenny Atlas of 1878, showing Michael and James Mitchell's farms in green. W. Mitchell in orange refers to Michael's brother, and the G. Mitchell just below that is likely his nephew, George. Michael's siblings. Michael's eldest sister, Janet, was the firstborn of Alexander and Mary in 1803. In Canada, she married Samuel Clark, brother of my fourth great-grandfather, David Clark, in 1833. Their children were Abigail Mary and James William. Throughout the letters, mention is made of this family. A couple of excerpts are from December 8th, 1861. Abby has got quite healthy again. She was married to Jonathan Kennedy. Him and his brother bought the Miles place on the ridge. They have made great improvements in the place. 4 years later, on December 2nd, 1865, I have the painful news to relate to you of the death of my oldest sister, Janet, Mrs. Clark. She died the 24th November. She was taken sick on Friday and died the Friday following. The doctor said it was the heart disease. Her daughter had been very bad with a sore breast, and she was up taking care of her and was taken sick and died in her daughter's house. It was a great deal harder on her. She will miss her mother. They lived close to each other, and they was backward and forward most every day. Michael does not say what had made Abby ill before 1861, but we get a better idea from a letter written by his daughter, Mamie, 10.5 years later. From April 8th, 1872, Abby Clark has been ill all winter. She has been in St. John since January. Jonathan brought her home a week ago. She has lost her reason. She was very wild at first and wanted someone to kill her. They had to lash her to the bed. She has got over that and is very melancholy. She thinks her soul is lost. She says she loved Jonathan better than she ever did her God, and he has cast her away. She runs of the idea that everybody is going to die and she will be left alone. She cries and moans all the time and begs of them to take her to Jesus. They have no hopes of her recovery. Abby's time in St. John would have been spent at the asylum pictured here. Sadly, Abigail Clark Kennedy died 5.5 years later on September 8, 1877, at the age of only 44, leaving Mary, her stepdaughter, and 4 children under the age of 18. And she's also buried in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. James was the eldest son of Alexander and Mary and seems to have inherited his father's ability to work with wood. He became known in the Keswick Ridge and Scotch settlement areas as a carpenter. His work is featured in several of the houses at King's Landing, New Brunswick, and James himself is portrayed by one of the historical interpreters. He married Frances Eustace, whose family home is part of the village and whose family is also portrayed by historical interpreters. William married Mary Ann Dobie, and they had 7 children. The Provincial Archives of New Brunswick has the original apprenticeship agreement between William and a Greenock, Scotland baker, William Walker, dated January 2nd, 1824. This apprenticeship was to span 3.5 years, so William had started August 12th, 1823. The Mitchells brought this document to Canada with them, even though, as stated in it, the indenture had been fulfilled in every respect by the said William Mitchell by February 12th, 1827. A couple of notable events occurred in the lives of William's children. Sadly, his son Alexander was killed by lightning at the age of 24. This headstone is in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. and another son, James, became New Brunswick's 8th premier, following work as a school teacher, lawyer, and in various governmental positions. His premiership was very brief, as he died following a long illness from cancer. His only child had died as a toddler. Christian Wiley, called Kersey, received her middle name from her mother's mother, Anne Wiley. She married James Anderson Campbell in 1835, and they had at least 6 children. Michael reported on Kersey's death in his letter dated April 16, 1865, saying, "She died 25th of March. She was a long while sick. The doctors say it was a cancer in her inside. She was 14 days and neither ate nor drank. Her family will miss her greatly. She had 3 boys and 3 girls. The youngest is 14 years old." Christian was 54 years old at her death. Alexander is next in line, being a year or so younger than John, who had died at sea. He married Sarah Anderson in 1841, and they had many children, about whom I can find little information. The eldest 2, George and Charlotte, died as small children in 1846. This makes me wonder what disease may have been sweeping through Fredericton at that time. Alexander, along with his younger brother Robert, was known in Fredericton as a skilled craftsman, as is mentioned in information provided to me by Evelyn Fiddler of King's Landing. Wyatt Ryder in Antique Furniture by New Brunswick Craftsmen, page 99 and 100, writes, "Working in Fredericton during the same period as Samuel F. Jones, but doing an entirely different style of cabinet work, were 2 brothers, Alexander and Robert Mitchell. The Mitchell brothers came originally from Dumfriesshire, Scotland in the early 1830s and made their home in Keswick, York County. Their beautifully constructed and carved interiors decorate the more important historical buildings in Fredericton. Early experts on the subject have recorded that Alexander and Robert Mitchell were craftsmen and artisans of remarkable excellence. Among the buildings in which the work of these brothers is to be found are Christ Church Cathedral, the woodwork, St. Anne's Parish Church, the York County Courthouse, the building formerly known as the Officers' Quarters, the construction of which started in 1839, and Government House in Fredericton, which served as the headquarters of the RCMP until 1988. Alexander and Robert Mitchell also made fine furniture. The known examples which have been examined by this writer were handsomely made of mahogany. A fine bureau and smaller items are owned by Miss Janet Curry of Andover, who is a direct descendant of Robert Mitchell. The bureau is ornamented with fine rope carving. The names of the Mitchell brothers are still listed in both the 1862 and 1865 directories, but at this time they had moved to the corner of Regent and Charlotte Streets. They are absent from the 1875 lists. Mary Mitchell married Solomon Denton in 1845. They do not appear to have had any children of their own, but somewhere I got the idea that they had adopted Annie Irvan. Who was Annie Irvan and who were her parents? How did she come to be adopted by Mary and Solomon, and where did she go? I've run up against a brick wall in this search. Sometimes I wish I kept better records, as now I'll be going back to try to unravel this mystery. Robert Mitchell married Miriam, also sometimes called Mary Ann Lee. They had 3 children and lived in Fredericton, where Robert worked as a craftsman with his brother Alexander. Isabella, the youngest of Michael's siblings, married John Anderson in 1850. They had 5 children, of whom the youngest, also named Isabella, died 8 weeks after her birth. Sadly, her mother Isabella appears to have died about a week after giving birth to this baby. This is the headstone of the mother and daughter Isabellas. The next year, John Anderson married Sarah Jane McKean. Together, they had a further 8 children. Political events. Michael's letters frequently mention political events that are occurring at the time of his writing. 3 notable events were the American Civil War Canada's Confederation, and the Fenian Raids. The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861. Simply put, using Wikipedia as my source, it was a war in the USA fought after the 11 southern states had left the United States and formed the Confederate States of America, which was also called the Confederacy. The US government and the states that remained loyal to it were called the Union. President Lincoln claimed the war was necessary to reunite the country. The abolition of slavery was another outcome of this conflict. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which was held by Union soldiers. After 4 years of fighting, the war ended on April 9, 1865, with the Union victorious. Michael's letter of December 8, 1861 comments, "The disturbance in the States had made a good deal of difference there, it seems. There is talk of 3 regiments going up through this province to the St. Lawrence. If that is the case, they must have something in view." I was curious about Canadians fighting in the American Civil War and discovered a number of interesting facts. Britain had declared itself neutral, and as a result, Canada and the Maritimes were also neutral. Canadians and Maritimers sold weapons to both sides, as well as offering other forms of support. While record keeping was not very reliable, it is thought that about 40,000 Canadians and Maritimers served. Most fought for the North, the Union, but there were many who fought for the Confederacy. There are a few reasons for this. Residents and businessmen of Canadian port cities sympathized with the South because their businesses were suffering due to a naval blockade. For example, Halifax merchant Benjamin Weir acted as agent for many of the Confederate blockade runners. In return for ship repair facilities in Halifax, the Confederates supplied him with cotton for re-export to Britain. This required Weir to sever his business connections with New England. As well, Maritimers who did not favor Canadian Confederation saw the Confederacy as a small power defying a larger power that did not protect its interests. Some Canadians were living and working in the US when the war began and volunteered with local regiments. Some left Canada to enlist, and some were tricked, bribed, and kidnapped by American recruiters. Canadians were generally against slavery, and Canada was the end of the Underground Railroad. Also, economic and cultural ties crossed the border, which encouraged sympathy for the Union. Among the Canadians to fight were 2 notable people. French-Canadian musician Calixa Lavallee, known for composing the music for our national anthem, was a Union officer who became a lieutenant during the Civil War. In 1857, he had moved to the United States and lived in Rhode Island, where he enlisted in the 4th Rhode Island Volunteers. Also, Sarah Edmonds, from central New Brunswick, disguised herself as a man and, using the alias Franklin Thompson, served as a male nurse in the Union Army. She also conducted many spy missions behind Confederate lines. One of the early events of the Civil War was the Trent Affair, a diplomatic incident in which, on November 8, 1861, Charles Wilkes, a Union Navy officer, captured 2 Confederate envoys, James Mason and John Slidell, aboard the British mail ship, the Trent. Michael was aware of this event and commented on it in his letter 1 month later when he wrote, "But England and them has got into some difficulty at sea, and it is not known how they are going to settle it yet." Mason and Slidell had been traveling to Britain and France to request diplomatic recognition for the Confederacy and financial and military support. Great Britain accused the United States of violating British neutrality, and the incident created a diplomatic crisis between the 2 countries. The British government demanded an apology and the release of the prisoners. It began to strengthen military forces in British North America and the North Atlantic. President Lincoln and his advisors did not want to risk war with Britain over this issue, and the crisis was resolved several weeks later when the Lincoln administration released the envoys and disavowed Captain Wilkes's actions, but without the formal apology. Mason and Slidell resumed their voyage to Europe. In the end, Canadian and maritime soldiers and sailors fought in almost every battle of the war. By the end, many had become officers, and 29 had won the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the highest military honor in the United States. The period of the Civil War created huge economic growth for Canada by providing a large market for agricultural and manufactured goods, mostly for the Union. Shipbuilders and owners in the Maritimes prospered during this period. There is a North Shore New Brunswick regiment that evolved during the British occupation of New England in the late 18th century. The region had grown significantly as British loyalists fled that area following the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Maritime colonial militias were part of the military action during the War of 1812, the American Civil War, and the Fenian raids of 1866 to 1871. Another political event written about by Michael was the Fenian threat. The Fenians, again in very simple terms, were a secret society of Irish American Civil War veterans who were Irish patriots. Between 1866 and 1871, they launched a series of cross-border raids into Canada with the intention of forcefully taking the country in order to exchange it with Britain for Ireland's independence. Each time, Canadian forces put down the insurrections, but not without significant losses on both sides. In a backhanded kind of way, the Fenians encouraged Canadians to support Confederation. Michael, in a letter dated December 2nd, 1865, says, "And there is great talk here about the Fenians going to rise in Canada. I want you to send me back word the first time you write." Most of the Fenian activity was concentrated in Upper Canada, with forces amassing near Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo, among other locations. However, there were also some early raids directed against New Brunswick sites. It would be interesting to know what David Clark, near Ingersoll, Ontario, had to say about his experience. Michael also sought opinions from the Ontario family about Confederation. In April 1865, he was considering visiting Canada and asked David Clark about a farm you have in view for me. He wanted to see the farm before selling up in New Brunswick, but commented that the New Brunswickers went so hard against uniting with the Canadians that it almost discouraged me, but I am in hopes they will get it to pass yet. There is a great many of the smartest men we have in the province is in favor of it. Funnily enough, he goes on to say, "For my part, I don't worry my head about it." And then he asks David, "I want you to let me know your opinion about it the first time you write." A few months later, Michael writes again about Confederation, saying, "There has been great talk of uniting these provinces and Canada. For my part, I think it would be a very good thing. I wish you would send me your opinion about it." Finally, in September 1867, once Confederation is a done deal, Michael writes, "I want you to send me your opinion about this great union that has taken place." The subject of the Mitchells moving to Upper Canada is mentioned in a few letters. Huldah was the only member of the Tripp family to have stayed behind in New Brunswick. I should say of William Tripp's family. In December of 1865, Michael writes that Mr. Oliver was in a great way for me to sell and come to Canada, but it is a hard matter to sell. I could have sold my place to Joseph Hagerman, but Huldah would not consent to it. Then in April 1872, Mamie writes, "Pa has not sold his farm yet, as then he would have been on to Canada before this. Pa says he thinks we cannot look after the farm while he is away. I am conceited enough to think that we could." And finally, in November 1873, Mamie writes something puzzling. "Pa has so many cases, he cannot leave." What does she mean? Is Michael practicing as a professional of some sort? Maybe a doctor or a lawyer? The census of 1871 lists him as a farmer. Over time, there were several members of various Clark families who did go to the Ingersoll area for a time and then moved on from there or returned to New Brunswick. The growth and expansion of the railroad in the Maritimes was another topic that held great interest for both Michael and his daughter, Mamie. They mention its progress in almost every letter, beginning with April 6, 1865, when Michael asks whether it would be better to have a railroad or not. For my part, I think there is too much snow here in the winter. And then in December 1870, he comments, they are talking of bridging the river at Fredericton, and we will cross when we like. There is strong talk of the railroad going up the Keswick Valley. If it goes there, it will make a very public place. Michael begins to pin his hopes of a visit to see the relations in Ontario on the completion of the railroad. After all, in Gordon and Grant's book, On the Ridge, it is reported that Michael's in-laws, William Tripp and Hannah Pickard, my fifth great-grandparents, had moved to Canada West by sleigh in the winter. A train trip would surely be a nicer way to travel such a distance. Michael's children. Returning to Scotch settlement, I'd like to provide some information about Michael's descendants. It's possible viewers will recognize some of these people and be very happy to share information. To begin, the Mitchell house in Scotch settlement, and thanks to Evelyn for sending me this photo, which I believe shows the house described in Michael's letter of January 2nd, 1865. He wrote, this summer we built a house and it kept us very busy. It is a very expensive job building. I will give you the size of it. It is 36 feet long by 26 feet wide. I have got a kitchen on the back, 15 feet by 17 long. We have 3 rooms on the first flat and 2 bedrooms and hall and a pantry and cook shop. Upstairs, we have a dormer window in the front of the house. It gives us light in the center of the house. We have a hall in the center and 3 rooms on the one side and 2 on the other side. We have 2 pairs of stairs. The cellar is the whole size of the house. I think it will be frost-proof. It is a very expensive job building. It cost me over $800. But I am clear all but about $10. Michael and Huldah's eldest child was Sarah Jane, born in 1849. She married James Gray sometime before 1881. I've not been able to find a record of their marriage. They had 3 children who are listed here with their spouses and children, who would be Michael's great-grandchildren. This is purported to be a photo of Sarah Jane Mitchell, but I don't know when it was taken. Could it be a wedding photo? It is in an ornate case, and the woman looks quite young. And thanks to Evelyn for sharing this. Sarah Jane and James Gray's eldest daughter, Jean Davidson Gray, married Sandy McGibbon, and they had 2 daughters, Mary Alexandria and Annie. Unfortunately, Mary died in her early 20s. Annie grew up and married David Anderson, and I understand there's a large collection of Anderson papers at the archives. I will definitely be visiting there again on my next trip east. I keep wondering if there might be photos of the Ontario relatives in that collection. And once again, thank you so much to Evelyn for this information. Mary McPherson Mitchell was the second child, and she was known as Mamie. Mamie married Asa Van Wart in 1878, and they had 3 children. It's interesting to note that in the 1891 census, their daughter Belle is listed as being 25 years old. Yet that would have made her birth year 1866. Their son William is not listed in that census, so perhaps he was away from home that day. He would have been about 8 years old. The eldest son, William, married Frances Hagerman, daughter of George B., and his wife, Abigail Jane Clark, known as Jane, and mentioned several times in the letters. She was the daughter of Samuel Clark and Abigail Jewett, but more importantly, the sister of David Clark in Ingersoll, Canada West. William and Frances moved to Massachusetts. I found no record of children. Michael and Hulda's middle child, Jacob B., died at the age of 2 years and 8 months and is buried in Scotch Settlement. Isabella Mitchell married her first cousin, James Birkmay Campbell, who was 22 years older. They had 2 sons, and I was fortunate to find a photo of them with the assistance of the Archives of New Brunswick. It's interesting to note that both of these boys died in 1942, although neither was fighting in World War II at the time. These are Ralph and Kenneth Campbell, around 1894 or 1895, judging by their ages. Evelyn Fiddler provided these pictures. In the top photo, I'm not sure if this is James Birkmay Campbell, father of Kenneth, or James Anderson Campbell, grandfather of Kenneth. I believe the photo was taken in the mid to late 1890s. Annie Campbell is unknown to me. She's listed in the 1921 census as a sister-in-law to a then widowed Isabella. Could she be a sister of James Birkmay or a wife of James Birkmay's brother? His sisters were Mary A., so possibly Annie, Susanna, and Sarah Lee. In the bottom photo, Isabella Mitchell Campbell and Janie, who was Sarah Jane Mitchell Gray, her eldest sibling. The comment, "our grandmother," was written by a child of either Jean Davidson Gray, Robert Michael Gray, or Mary Ferguson Gray. Michael and Hulda's youngest daughter, Janet, was given the second name of Clark. The Clarks were a family in Scotch Settlement from whom I'm also descended. Michael's eldest sister, Janet, had married Samuel Clark, brother of David, who came to Ontario, and I'm guessing this is where the name came from. The photo was taken by J. Harvey in Fredericton and came from an ancestry user in Arizona. This Janet married Alexander Lemuel Haining, and they moved west to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. In 1929, Mamie Mitchell Van Wart swore an affidavit as to Janet's birth date for a birth certificate. At this point, Janet was living in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Interestingly, Mamie gave October 28, 1861 as her sister's date of birth. Yet I have Michael's letter referring to this birth and giving his new daughter's birth date as November 8, 1861. The 2 dates are not all that far apart, but it shows the value of primary sources in terms of accuracy. I expect a new father's recollection of his daughter's birth to be more accurate than the memory of a 78-year-old sister. Why did Janet need this certificate? Possibly it was required to allow her to move to the United States, as her residence in 1930 as a widow is St. Louis, Missouri. Another piece of information came from this certificate. Part 19 asks about the number of children of this mother. It's right down here, it's a very small section. Referring to Hulda Tripp Mitchell. Number born alive? Mamie answered 6. Number now living? She answered 5. Number stillborn? Mamie responded 6. How very sad for Michael and Hulda. Amos Mitchell was the youngest child. He married Sarah Martha Coburn in 1892. I don't believe they had any children. They appear to have remained in the Scotch settlement house that Michael built, as is shown in this photo. I understand from Janice Allen of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society that the house may still be standing. That gives me another reason to return to New Brunswick. Michael Shaw Stewart, our letter writer, died on July 27, 1897, in Scotch Settlement, York County, New Brunswick. He is buried in Scotch Settlement Cemetery. He was 84 years old. None of his 3 sons, of whom 2 lived to adulthood, had children. Therefore, the surname of his branch of the family tree died out. However, Michael's 4 brothers all had sons. So I am hopeful that the line of Alexander Mitchell a native of Berwickshire, Scotland, lives on in his descendants. And I will stop sharing. Ooh, in case anybody has any questions or anything.
Thank you. If you have questions, see,
Sorry.
or questions online, but if you want to ask a question from here, speak up because the microphone is in that camera.
My name is Joan Edwards, and if you go back in my history, my mother was a Curry, her mother was a Hagerman, and her mother was an Anderson. And one of your slides that I couldn't see the numbers, but one of the slides, one of the first child was Mary Lily Anderson. Well, I did an Anderson genealogy years ago, and they're all in that.
Oh, neat. So there's-
It's online somewhere.
So you have a connection with, then you're connected to the Mitchells as well.
I think so, and this is the other thing. I have been laden, I think, with 2 boxes. And it could be letters, it could be pictures, it could be that they belong to the Curry, Hagerman families. And I just got those. And I haven't had a chance to go through any of them. But there's so much, but I remember, and I don't know if anyone knows about that Mitchell house. Does anyone know if it is around? No. See, I don't know either. So
Janice Allen told me she thought it had fallen into a bit of disrepair and it's being rented, she thought. Or it might have been Evelyn, but I think it was Janice Allen. And that, yes, and that there might be someone around named Clarence Gray, who might be descended from Robert Gray and on down. That would be from the Sarah Jane Mitchell, who was Michael's eldest child.
That's another thing is there's 2 Gray families. One's G-R-E-Y and one's G-R-A-Y, and I don't know how that happened or if they're related or changed or what.
Yeah, sometimes names like my Clarks come with an E and without an E. Just depends who's writing it. Yeah, thank you. And what's your name?
Joan Edwards.
Oh, great. Well, it's nice to meet you, Joan. And if you you can get my information from Russ and various other members if you want to ever send me an email, or if you find any photos that say Ontario on them, boy, would I love to see those.
I enjoyed it. Is this one that we can look at later? Yes.
Yeah, I believe Russ is recording it and it will be on the website.
This is something that I'd love to go through 3 or 4 times. Yes. There was so much information in there. And I know also the trips were related at some point and everything.
How about that? Yeah, well, I'd love to meet you when I come down. Thank you. I see Evelyn had a couple of comments. She said probably cholera was sweeping through Fredericton in 1846. That would be when Alexander's eldest 2, George and Charlotte, died. And then she asked if any of the Mitchell family fought for the Union Army. I am not aware of that. And Michael does not mention that in any of the letters. I also have a whole second batch of letters written by Daniel and Mary Clark. Mary was Mary Haynes Clark, and Daniel was Daniel Jewett Clark, son of Samuel Clark and Abigail Jewett. And it'll be interesting because they are also in the same time period, but they'll have a whole different. So I'm hoping maybe to do a presentation like this on the Clark letters next year. And then that way you'll have the full picture of the letters that we have. And then I'm donating them as well to the Historical Society and then to the Archives of New Brunswick. So.
Are there any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. Back in about 2004, I met a woman by chance up in Ontario whose father was the teacher here at this Superior School in 1936.
Wow.
He and her mother and father and brother were living or boarding, I don't know which it was, in what would have been the Smith's house at McKean Corner. And it was the Smiths that owned the old store. And that was part of their property. And this lady in Ontario, in 2004, she was talking about her memories of 1930s on the Ridge. And she only lived here about 3 or 4 years while her father was teaching here. But one of the names that she mentioned was Jimmy Mitchell. And
Oh.
what she described, Jimmy Mitchell at that time would have been in the mid-30s, would have been about 10 years old or 12 years old. And she talked about him as being an incorrigible little boy. and how when she described where he lived in the mid-30s, it sounded to me like it was Heather's house on the Ridge.
Oh, yeah.
Going down there.
Yes, and I'm not sure what name we use for that house, but not too far from McKean Corner, where the Mitchells lived. Now, and I don't know what little Jimmy Mitchell, incorrigible Jimmy Mitchell's father's name was. But when you mentioned James Mitchell's, it made me think about that family. That
Yeah,
story.
well, yes, because there were now, some of them had gone to, so Alexander and Robert had obviously gone to Fredericton, but I didn't even come, like, I came as far down genealogically as I thought made sense to give you people a picture, but I could have probably gone another generation, although on Ancestry, some of it starts to show as private because some of these people are still living. But yes, I think, and Evelyn said, we're sure that there are Mitchell descendants out there. And I'm really hoping that maybe some of them will see this and either have information to share, or I'm also going to take the slides of the genealogies from here and make them into a small pamphlet and send them out to add to your genealogy collection, so that that'll be there for people who are interested in the Mitchells. Because I really couldn't find, I mean, all I had, which was kind of neat, I had these letters written by M. Mitchell, Michael Mitchell, he calls himself different things, and some dates. And I had to just start with that and then put his family together. So I like to call genealogy detective work without danger. Because that's what it feels like a lot of the time. You're doing a lot of detective work. But yeah, it's been very, very enjoyable putting all this Mitchell information together. And you know, there's a lot more out there. Like now that I knew, I didn't know when I was down east a year and a half ago about the Annie and David Anderson phone at the archives. And now that I know about that, I want to go and have a really good look through it, because that may be where the photos of the Ontario people ended up. And who knows, maybe the Ontario people's letters are even there somewhere. I mean, if we kept the letters from New Brunswick, who's to say people in New Brunswick didn't keep the letters from Ontario? And wouldn't that be amazing? So yes, anyway,
What
been
about
very, go ahead.
diaries from those families?
Yeah, there's a Sarah Martha Coburn diary at the archives. I think it's 1917.
Okay.
I have journals of the Clarks here. I have their agricultural journals, and a lot of other, I have their wills, some things like that, but mostly the Ingersoll family. These letters are really the only thing that I have from New Brunswick. Well, there are some photos that I haven't been able to identify. Some are obviously taken in Ingersoll, but some of them don't say where they were taken. And it's made me wonder if some of them might be some of the New Brunswick relatives. Yeah, it's a never ending search.
Yeah, what was the reason that they went to Ingersoll in particular? What was it's an agricultural area.
So
But
William Tripp came down with Hannah Pickard and all of his children except Huldah. And I believe it's because Jonathan Tripp was already here, and Moses Tripp. And there's a Jonathan Tripp who it's a very interesting thing. So this is why I love this so much. So Jonathan Tripp was a landowner in Ingersoll, and they had come in maybe even the 30s, maybe the 40s. And he gets into a land dispute with a neighbor. And I was able to, because I was looking for their land patents. So I found all this. So I found all the information about the dispute and all these affidavits labeled, you know, George Nickel says this, Jonathan Tripp says that, he says this, he says that. Then lo and behold, I found a DVD series at my library about the War of 1812 that goes into the whole story of this George Nickel. Now, he's not related, but it was still fascinating to hear about this and to hear about his land. But I'm wondering, I'm thinking William maybe was a brother of Jonathan, but I don't know who their father was. I don't know if they were Peleg Tripp's kids or not. And Roger and I have talked briefly about it, but we've never really solved that. So that's another mystery to be discovered. But there was also a Moses Tripp who was a druggist, and he had a drugstore in Ingersoll. So I think some of them came down for land. And William, I mean, he had a whole whackload of sons, Jacob Denton, Solomon, John Warney. He had a bunch of sons and some daughters. A bunch of them, some of them ended up being doctors, which was kind of interesting. I think one family ended up with 4 doctors in it, which I thought was pretty impressive for the time. So there's still, Sheila, tons more research to do in that area.
Yeah, I'm
But-
sure.
Yeah, it must have been land. I mean, that's all I can think of. If you had that many sons and only a couple hundred acres in New Brunswick, you need to go somewhere else. And
It's
find
almost
places.
interesting about to try to find out why a family would move to a particular area.
Yes, yeah,
In some cases, I think it takes one person to move there and be successful.
Yes,
Because that's how Anne's family came from Newfoundland.
yeah,
A brother went, and then when my father came along and had to leave home, and the brother said, come on down, I can help you get a job. Yeah.
yes.
yes, exactly. Yeah. I think that's often what happens. So maybe Jonathan went out there and now Jonathan ended up in Indiana after this land dispute. So he kept moving west, but you know, and I mean, things were opening up then. So if you were an adventurous sort, what blew me away was that William and Hannah traveled by sleigh in the winter. But it is, I always wondered how they traveled, and I thought maybe it would have been, there was a ship to Boston, overland to the Erie Canal. That was one route that people would take. And yeah, because I'm in contact with a Clark here, a Clark descendant. Anyway, there's, yeah. I could talk about it all day, but I don't want to bore everybody to death, so.
Amazing history.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah,
much chance-
I find it fascinating, yeah.
Not much chance of that, I think. Gillian, questions? I think we can say thank you for a really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. It really made me get my ducks in a row. And now I'll start working on the Clark group, and because I don't want to keep these papers. I don't want my children to have to deal with all of this. And it had already been in an attic for, 100 and however many years, 150 years. So it's time to get it out there where history students can be looking at it and learning from it. And so that's kind of my goal, to finish with all these things and then get them donated to various archives, basically where they originated. So the letters from New Brunswick will obviously go to the New Brunswick archives in the end, after Evelyn has a chance at them.
Okay,
Okay,
thanks,
well,
Gillian.
looking forward to your next trip down east.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.
Maybe in the summer. Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.